The Second World War was the largest and most destructive war in human history. And in addition to its grim human toll, it laid waste to entire communities, from villages to cities, from Europe to China. But the United States, oceans away, was largely free from such destruction. Largely, but not entirely. At the end of November 1944, the tiny town of Tolar, New Mexico, became what has been described as the only town in America to have been destroyed because of World War II. Roosevelt County in east central New Mexico, on the border with Texas, is today rather sparsely populated. With less than 20,000 residents in a county of more than 2,400 square miles, the population density is less than 8 people per square mile. More than two-thirds of those live in the county seat, Portales. In 1899, the Pecos Valley and Northeastern Railway, or Peavine, reached Portales, opening the area to more settlement, and in 1901 a man named Alvin Jeter applied for 160 acres under the Homestead Act, some 50 miles west of Portales. The population was quite sparse, but the area was about to see a boom thanks to a much larger railroad company. A 1989 edition of Santa Fe Modeler explains, the Union Pacific and the Rock Island systems were building into the Southwest during the early 20th century. These competing lines were not burdened with excessive grades, such as plagued the Santa Fe's main line in northern New Mexico. The Santa Fe needed its own low-grade line to remain competitive, and a proposed connection from the Santa Fe-affiliated Pecos Valley and Northeastern Railway near the Texas border to the Rio Grande near Albuquerque seemed promising. A charter for the new railroad was obtained in October 1902, and with the new railroad coming, Roosevelt County, named after then-President Theodore Roosevelt, was established in 1903. While the Santa Fe had a line running through northern New Mexico, the new line offered an advantage. The Roswell Daily Record explained in 1907. On the present main line there are two summits, one at Raton Pass, 7,608 feet above sea level, and one at Glorieta, 7,421 feet above sea level. On the new line, there's but one summit, having an elevation of 6,492 feet. The new 268.3-mile line would be called the Belen Cutoff, and while the Santa Fe passenger service, the Daily Record notes, would use the northern line and continue to pass through Albuquerque, where the company owns much valuable property, especially in the hotel and depot, the new line would carry freight on the lines between Chicago and the coast, saving great cost by avoiding the steeper grades. And with the new railroad came new opportunities to the area. The Albuquerque Citizen wrote in 1905, in its efforts to lower its grades for the transcontinental haul from Chicago to the Pacific coast, the Santa Fe Railroad is opening up virgin territory in eastern and central New Mexico, larger than many of the eastern states, reached heretofore only by the Sheep Path and the Indian Trail. One such place was near where Alvin Jeter had homesteaded. Gravel and sand for the construction of the line was collected in the spot along the track, and in 1905, before the city was even platted, a post office was opened. The first postmaster, J.W. Coleman, named the new town Tolar, after the town of Tolar, Texas, where his daughter lived. The Roswell Daily Record wrote in 2019, the town was platted in 1908, and by 1911, 600 people lived there. But the railroad boom did not last. In fact, the website New Mexico Counties notes that there are 106 ghost towns in Roosevelt County, and was once home to the largest windmill collection in the world. The Daily Record reported in 1926 the school closed when it was consolidated with one in the neighboring town of Tyban. The railroad station closed in March of 1933. By 1944, while war raged elsewhere, Tolar was about as far from the front as any place could be. The town still had a post office, but the population had dropped to an estimated 30 people living along the tracks of the Santa Fe Railroad. But the railroad was, of course, busy. On November 30th, 1944, a freight train of 81 cars was passing through Tolar when, around noon, one of the axle bearings overheated. The bearings were in what was called a journal box, and when such bearings overheat, often because the oil used to lubricate them had dried out, it is called a hot box. A representative of the railroad told the Albuquerque Tribune, the journal of an oil car broke, letting the truck down and causing derailment of 37 cars of the train. Fire broke out. The Clovis News-Journal wrote on December 1st, 1944, that two men, Albert Jones of Clovis and C.A. Watkins, said they had seen a fire on the train and went to ask the crewmen if there were any explosives on board. It was a good question to ask. The train was a mixed freight train, carrying lots of things. Peanuts, airplane engines for U.S. Navy planes, corned beef, mattresses, And the Daily Record wrote in 2019, 160 500-pound bombs, enough to fill 4 B-29 bombers. A Santa Fe executive told the Tribune, while the train conductor was telephoning Clovis to report the blaze, the explosion occurred. Historian Randy Dunson was quoted on the website of the Roosevelt County Chamber of Commerce. Your generation remembers exactly where they were on 9/11, and my generation remembers the Kennedy assassination. My parents' and grandparents' generation remember December 7th. But in this area, they remember the Tolar train explosion. The News Journal reported that bombs for the Pacific Theater of Operations, bombs that properly sent earthward towards their targets, would have wrought even more death and destruction than occurred at the small New Mexico town. These bombs virtually blasted Tolar off the map. The blast was enormous. The News Journal wrote the day of the accident that the explosion was heard in Clovis, more than 30 miles away. Scattered for a mile away were twisted, burnt pieces of machinery. Heavy iron and steel parts of the ill-fated train littered the ground in a wide radius, indiscriminately strewn around the bushels and bushels of peanuts, the hardwood, and bursting cans of corned beef, army rations. The Las Cruces Sun-News reported that the explosion, rocking the countryside, leveled several buildings at Tolar, and flames spread through the train. One freight car was blown astride the highway besides the tracks. The News Journal wrote the day after the accident that an officer reported finding an airplane engine, which was blown from the train, a mile away from the explosion. The Albuquerque Journal wrote the next day, F.G. Hightower, highway employee, said the explosion shook his truck a mile from the scene and sent debris 5,000 feet in the air. The blast, felt here 43 miles to the east, derailed 39 cars of the 81-car Santa Fe Railway freight train, of which the bomb car was a part, and demolished several buildings at Tolar. All of the dwellings within a half-mile radius were damaged to some extent, and the following buildings at Tolar were wrecked: the empty schoolhouse, the post office, Watkins store. As to the store, the Journal wrote that a freight car axle plummeted through the roof of Watkins store, and the roof on the rear part of the store collapsed. The News Journal reported that all of the windows on the south side of the house of Mrs. J.F. Harris, 1/2 mile north of the railroad tracks, were broken, and a heavy piece of metal landed in their yard. And Early Bruner, living 2 miles west and 1 south of Melrose, heard the explosion from his farm home, but thought possibly that it was a bomber explosion. He jumped into his car and, after spotting the great columns of smoke, found his way to the wrecked community. The response was quick. The News Journal reported that Clovis and Sumner Army Airfield sent firefighters to the scene, but intense heat thwarted efforts to check the flames, and that all physicians in the Clovis area were reported to have been summoned to the blast. These included medicos from the Clovis and Fort Sumner Army Air Bases. The air bases sent more than firefighters and doctors, as the News Journal reported. Again reminding one of the war, however, were the fast P-40s from the Fort Sumner base that swooped and dived over to the area. But what of the town's residents? A witness told the News Journal that when we circled around the black pall of smoke, hot and cindery, our first thought was to wonder how anyone could have survived the terrible blast that would have had to have occurred to wreak such havoc. Survival for some did seem to be nearly miraculous. The proprietor of the store, Mrs. C.A. Watkins, was inside the store at the time. The News Journal wrote the day after the accident that Mrs. Watkins said, "Crepe paper saved my life." She explained that just before the blast, she had gone from the back of the store to the front to arrange a crepe paper display. This was the only portion of the store where the roof didn't fall in. She was not, however, entirely unscathed. The News Journal continues. She said she jumped through the front window of the store, suffering minor cuts on her head. But what of the rest of the town? In fact, it seems a stroke of luck that the school had been shut down in 1926. The Carlsbad Current-Argus reported that loss of more lives was believed to be averted because children were attending a consolidated school some miles distant. In another stroke of luck, the Current-Argus reported women of half the 6 families living at Tolar were shopping at Melrose. Some residents were shaken. The Current-Argus reported that violence of the blast hurled Mrs. F.G. Forrest, mother of Mrs. Watkins, from the porch back into her home. The News Journal reported that Mrs. Harris was 83 years old and said that the door was blown off its hinges and that she and the door were blown into the house together. And yet the News Journal reported, several hours after the blast, Mrs. Forrest said that she was all right, except for still being scared to death. The Current-Argus reported that Mrs. H.H. Smith, postmaster, and A.C. Lash were knocked sprawling before the post office. The railroad reported that the train crew were uninjured, as were Mr. Jones and Mr. Watkins, who had been close to the train checking out the fire. The town, however, didn't completely avoid tragedy. The Albuquerque Journal reported, "Dead is Jesse Brown, cement block maker at Tolar, who was struck in the head by a bomb fragment as he watched the fire from about 50 yards. He succumbed en route to Melrose Hospital. Still, a witness told the News Journal, after getting a closer view of the wrecked buildings, we were amazed that only one death occurred from the explosion. Still, the News Journal understood the significance of what had happened. Tolar was not the target of an enemy bomber, but those who looked into the buildings, whose roofs were caved in, and saw the extravagant and expensive waste of material goods in the two small stores, one of which had its wares spilling through a huge hole in the side where an axle had hurled through the building. Those who saw debris from the wreckage hurled as far as a mile away from the scene, and those who heard the folks out there wonder what one ancient lady would do now that her home was virtually wrecked. Those people possibly thought, as did we, this is what war means. This is but a small portion of damages in the eyes of people who've undergone bombings for years. You have likely never heard of Tolar, New Mexico, unless you happened upon the historical marker that the New Mexico Department of Transportation erected in 2014 at remote mile marker 344 on U.S. Route 60. To be sure, the accident could have been much worse. Because it happened at midday, most of Tolar's residents were out of town at work. Only 6 residents were there when the accident occurred. And of course, it could have occurred in a much bigger town like Clovis or Albuquerque or any of the towns and cities in America, where trains loaded with all sorts of explosives ran day and night during the war. But it didn't. Happened in a tiny town in New Mexico, and only one person died. Hardly a footnote in the face of war. The accident merited a single paragraph, just 3 short sentences at the bottom of page 25 of the December 1st, 1944 edition of the New York Times. The FBI investigated, determined it was just an industrial accident, and the Santa Fe Railroad had the railroad repaired and running again by December 2nd. But for Tolar, it was too much. Already in decline, the loss of its only stores just hastened its demise. The post office was repaired and reopened, but closed again by 1946. All that's left today, the Daily Record notes, is dust and tumbleweeds blowing through the ghost town. They report, the blast left a crater 22 feet deep and 66 feet wide, and the town of Tolar would be no more. How ironic, the News Journal opined, for those of us who thought ourselves safe and secure from this aspect of the war. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.